All right. Cheers and salutations. My name is Kit. This is Americans Learn. And um, I was told to check out this video from Geographics titled, I think I'm going to probably say it long, Kowloon, Walled City, Hong Kong's City of Darkness. Now, this sounds familiar because it was actually an inspiration for a game called Stray. For those of you who don't know, it was a game where you play as a cat in the far, far future. Humanity is long since extinct, but the remnants of human civilization is found in an underground city area, which in turn is maintained by robots that could or could not have the minds of the, well, once extinct human species. And you have to face off against these Lovecraftian horrors that supposedly feed off the garbage, but whatever. It is what it is, but it is rather fascinating. It was a fascinating game to play as, and apparently the cityscape in which you play as the cat is based on Kowloon, the walled city, or at least that's what I remember reading the Wikipedia page. I know I'm cheating, but I want to check this thing out, and you know what? Let's find out more about Hong Kong City of Darkness. Hong Kong, aka Secret Pirate Island. If you got the references from The Simpsons. But without further ado, since I'm in charge of the ones and twos, let's get ready to see this video and play this video in a 3, a 2, and an uno. That's a horrible way to pause on a person, but all right.
Imagine, if you will, a city of eternal night, a place so intensely crowded that sunlight never penetrates its alleyways. Overhead, wires dangle from the ceilings, neon signs fizz in doorways. All around you, 33,000 people are crammed into self-built apartments barely 10 meters square, while overhead great airships rumble through the sky. Is this a vision of the future, the setting perhaps of some dystopian sci-fi novel? Not
Warhammer 40k. It's like a hive city. There. Warhammer 40k.
quite. The place we've just described was very real and existed within most of our lifetimes. Its name was Kowloon Walled City. It was once the most densely
I got it right. 10 points for Gryffindor.
inhabited place on Earth. Situated on the edge of Hong Kong, the walled city was a place devoid of oversight, claimed by both China and Britain and administered by neither. It grew out of the needs of the poor who flooded there, determined to rebuild their lives. But was Kowloon Walled City merely a gigantic slum, or was it something more? A radical experiment in communal living and architecture that broke all the rules. Well, today we're tiptoeing through alleys of eternal night to explore the most dystopian city to have ever existed. The standard image of Kowloon Walled City, preserved in pictures, is of a high-rise slum surrounded by skyscrapers, more or less how it looked at the moment of its demise in 1994. But to understand how this concrete behemoth came to exist in the first place, we're going to have to travel back through time all the way to 1839. China is still ruled by the Imperial Qing dynasty. The British Empire still straddles the globe. And these two global powers, they're about to go toe-to-toe in a fight that will reshape Asia. The First Opium War was as one-sided as watching the incredible
Opium War. Hey, don't worry. We now have the Oxycontin War now. Thanks, Johnson & Johnson. Seriously, no, there is an opioid crisis now. Hey, 1839 meet 2024. Things are still grimdark.
Hulk step into a ring with the Andrex puppy. By 1842, China had lost so badly that it was forced to hand over Hong Kong to the British. However, the Hong Kong the British received in 1842 was smaller than the Hong Kong we know today. Specifically, the area of Kowloon was just outside. And it was here, in Kowloon, that an old fort lay. Dated to the Song dynasty of 960 to 1279 AD, it was this semi-forgotten building that would one day form the core of the walled city. The 19th century progressed, with China losing yet another opium war to the British and handing over yet more territory. By the time Beijing had also lost the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895, the Chinese state was effectively unable to control its borders. This may be why the British were able to force yet another treaty on the Qing, finally giving them control of Kowloon. But the British Empire had a bit of a problem. While China might be weak, it was also very big and very close to Hong Kong. By contrast, London was nearly 10,000 kilometers away. If the Chinese were really determined to hold on to part of Kowloon, there was little that the British could do about it. And it turns out the Chinese really wanted to keep the old Song Dynasty fort. In the 1898 Second Convention of Peking, Beijing insisted on inserting a line asserting ownership of Kowloon Fort. In full it read, "The Chinese officials now stationed there shall continue to exercise jurisdiction except so far as may be inconsistent with the military requirements for the defense of Hong Kong." To which the British presumably replied, "Yeah, absolutely, for sure," while secretly crossing their fingers behind their backs and winking at one another. In May 1899, less than a year after the Second Convention of Peking had been signed, British troops marched on Kowloon Fort, chucked the Chinese out, and proclaimed it a part of the British Empire. Just as they'd calculated, Beijing did not put up a fight. That line in the convention about the Chinese owning the fort had been shown to be nothing but words on a sheet of paper. But here's the thing about words. For such insubstantial things, they have a funny way of shaping reality. It was words on a sheet of paper, after all, that had given Hong Kong to the British in the first place. It was words on a sheet of paper, in this case the Zimmermann telegram, that would drag the US into World War I. Before long, the British were going to regret giving Beijing something as powerful as those words.
Already looking down the alleyway, it looks like the first levels of the game Stray.
You can trace how the fortunes of both China and Britain changed over the 20th century by looking at how the British treated squatters in Kowloon Fort. In June 1933, for example, the colonial government in Hong Kong became concerned about Chinese peasants living in the ruins. So they drove them out. While the peasants complained to Beijing, Beijing was essentially like, guys, we already lost like 2 opium wars, we're not going to fight the British again. And, well, that was that. Peasants driven out. But jump forward 20-odd years and things had changed. In 1947, the British Empire was still reeling from the near-fatal blow that it had received in World War II. Across the border, China was devouring itself in a bloody civil war between communists and nationalists. As the bodies piled up, thousands fled across the border into Hong Kong. Destitute, in need of a place to live, many of them converged on the Kowloon Fort. By 1948, 2,000 Chinese refugees were squatting there.
How the hell did that happen? Okay, well, I guess that's how it happened.
That January, the colonial police tried to eject them. On January the 12th, officers marched into Kowloon Fort, expecting a routine removal. What they got instead was 2,000 angry refugees attacking them with rocks. The resulting street battle was a disaster for the police. Although luckily no one was killed, 6 were injured and the fort had to be surrendered to the refugees. Now, could the British have taken Kowloon Fort if they really wanted to? Well, absolutely. This is the British Empire we're talking about. These are the guys who conquered half the bloody world. But 1948, it wasn't a year when the Empire felt like conquering anything. London had barely survived World War II. The Empire had just lost India in an orgy of ethnic cleansing known as partition. There simply wasn't the will to spark trouble in Hong Kong too. So, the colonial authorities, they retreated, biding their time. In the end, they would have to wait decades. On the 1st of October 1949, Chairman Mao's communist forces declared victory in the Chinese Civil War. Everyone who wasn't a dyed-in-the-wool socialist fled, many of them into Kowloon. Come 1950, the population of the fort had hit 17,000 people. And it wasn't just...
That's a lot of people. Hey, look, maybe instead of being mean, let's actually do indoor plumbing, Taco Bell, antibiotics, schools and education, things that everybody wants.
Just refugees anymore. Criminals, dropouts, peasants, anarchists, and people fleeing the law had all joined this melting pot on the fringes of Hong Kong. It was at this time that Kowloon Fort became Kowloon Walled City. On January the 11th, 1950, a massive fire ripped through the fort's makeshift town. Although firefighters intervened, they only managed to save the ancient core. In the aftermath, those who'd been living there didn't go anywhere else. They returned, and they began to rebuild. Out of necessity, they constructed new homes atop one another. A kind of architecture began to take hold, one that grew organically according to its residents' needs. It was from these humble beginnings that the vast walled city of legend it began to grow. But the colonial authorities, they weren't done trying to evict its citizens. In March 1962, the British announced that they would demolish the walled city in 1 year. As they had in 1933, the residents complained to Beijing. This time, though, Beijing listened. Mao's government declared the British had no right to interfere in the walled city. He stated that it belonged to Communist China. They waved about the Second Convention of Peking, highlighting those words that the British had foolishly agreed to a very long time ago. So what else could Britain do? Well, faced with the prospect of war with Communist China, the authorities, they just agreed not to interfere in the walled city. Importantly, though, they also didn't give Beijing permission to enter Hong Kong and administer the place either. Suddenly, the walled city, it existed in a diplomatic no man's land, a place where neither China nor Britain was able to enforce their laws.
So you know what that means. Some good old-fashioned, hard-working mobsters probably moved on in where the legit authority, legitimate businessmen, going by the name probably the Triad, moved in there. Hey, let's have a debate in the comments section. Who's more honest? A good old-fashioned politician or a mobster? What's the difference? Type in the comment section below. That's what I see happening.
And it was from this legal quirk that one of the strangest cities in human history would spring. Okie dokie, so that's the story of how Kowloon Walled City came to be. Now it's time for us to take a trip inside, to wander its alleys and discover what it was like to actually live there. Well, the first thing to note is that it was incredibly cramped. After 1963, the number of people in the walled city did not top out at 17,000. More and more kept on arriving. Refugees from Mao's Cultural Revolution or Hong Kong citizens who'd been ruined by the 1973 stock market crash. But even as their numbers swelled to an all-time high of 33,000, the space they had to live in, it stayed static. The Kowloon Fort's limits covered an area roughly the size of 4 FIFA soccer pitches. While the British weren't about to interfere inside it, you can bet your sweet backside they also weren't about to let it keep growing. That meant that new arrivals had only one direction to build if they wanted homes, and that was up. By the 1980s, the walled city reached 14 stories into the sky, the maximum it could hit without causing serious risk to the planes landing at Hong Kong Airport.
Hey, we'll just have them build up. That's a brilliant idea, Bobby. Hey, that's not how you say my name in Chinese. Build up, stupid, up. Okay, great. What could go wrong?
Rickety towers that made up its height weren't apartment blocks that you or I would recognize. Okay. While some residents had normal-sized living spaces, the average block in the walled city was effectively a whole bunch of 30-square-meter apartments balanced precariously atop one another. In some blocks, these one-room apartments were barely 10 square meters, smaller than the average American bedroom. And yes, we totally looked up the size of the average American bedroom for this video. I mean, who knew that anyone was actually counting? Within these tiny apartments, you would have multiple families living. Typically, 3 or 4 generations would live in a space not much bigger than a closet. The kids doing their homework in one corner while mum and pop ran their business from the front. Yep, that's right, business. Just like any city.
You know what? Hey, gotta hustle. Hustle, gotta keep on making it, and a hustle.
Kowloon Walled City needed its entrepreneurs to keep things working. For many families, this meant turning the front of their apartment into some kind of shop. But there were bigger businesses too. Because neither the British nor the Chinese could enforce their labor laws, the Walled City became a mecca for those wishing to operate without a license. Slaughterhouses set up shop, unlicensed dentists, factories. Surrounded by the...
I'm sorry. There was a word there that is a respectable profession called dentist, but the word before, unlicensed dentist, that don't sound so good.
The din and bustle of this human hive, workers would package food for consumption across Hong Kong. It is said that at one point, 80% of all rice balls consumed in the territory were prepared right here in these dingy corridors. Speaking of food, the walled city was famous for its snacks. You could get a siu mai for the equivalent of $1. That's if you weren't busy frequenting the various noodle bars. Noodles in the city were so good that the average Hong Kong resident would go to the walled city more for the gastronomic experience than for anything to do with crime.
That oodles and noodles. Oodles and oodles and oodles and oodles and noodles. Yeah. Oodles and oodles and oodles and oodles and noodles. The noodles and oodles and oodles and oodles and noodles. Noodles and noodles and noodles. Oodles and noodles. Noodles and oodles. Gotta love the noodles and oodles.
But that being said, crime did exist there. It wasn't exactly the den of iniquity portrayed by popular culture, but it also wasn't a shiny utopia. And now it's time we met the shady people running the show.
Okay.
With no nation able to exert control over the walled city, you might be wondering how it didn't just transform into a permanent Hunger Games. The answer is that there were people enforcing order amidst chaos, but it wasn't the police. In this city, it was the triads that called the shots. While the triads
I hope somebody pick up that phone, because I freaking called it. The triads in the house.
are synonymous in Western culture with violence, within the walled city, their role was different. Lacking anyone else to do the job, the triads were basically City Hall. They organized waste collection, recruited a volunteer fire department, kept order in the cramped alleyways, paid elderly residents pensions. There was even an old folks' home located in one of the blocks where the triads arranged for the old and infirm to be looked after. But still, criminals are gonna be criminals. While they might have
they're just little rapscallions. Leave them be.
been able to fulfill some basic social functions, the triads couldn't help themselves from indulging in a little bit of classic gangsterism on the side. The most destructive, of course, was the drugs trade. Getting high in the walled city was an absurdly easy thing to do. Opium dens flourished in its darkest corners, while the rampant heroin trade allowed you to go on the nod in the comfort of your tiny home. There was even a hierarchy of drug users. The wealthier indulged in opium, while those less well off shot heroin. For the equivalent of 3 US cents, you could drift away and forget your troubles, even if only for an hour. Unsurprisingly, this led to rampant addiction and all the attendant social ills. There were rumors of addicts dying inside their tiny apartments and not being discovered for months, of families hiding corpses so they didn't have to pay the funeral costs. Yet, while darkness undoubtedly flourished in the walled city, so did a lighter side of life. You won't see it in the many films set there, but the walled city was a functioning society. It had schools, kindergartens, libraries. There were even 2 temples you could pray at, one squeezed down in the darkness of the lower floors and one situated beneath the skylight that was frequently buried under garbage. People did normal jobs here too, albeit with a unique twist. There were mailmen, a whole bunch of them. Each day they would spend 8 hours scrambling up and down the infinite blocks, navigating the preposterous numbering system, squeezing through alleys which were an average of 90 centimeters wide.
I bet those mailmen got a lot of stories, man. Hey, how's your day at the job? You don't believe what happened on my route today. Everything seems to always happen to you, mailman. Oh, you have no idea. Kowloon Mailman. The story of it. Oh, I thought of a movie. I just said it on the internet too. Someone's gonna steal my idea. Kowloon Mailman. Kowloon Mailwoman. There you go. There you go. See? All right.
Because it had grown without any central planning, walking the walled city wasn't like walking a normal city block. In the late 1980s, one resident tried to map the place. It took him the best part of 6 years to record the strange twists and turns and hidden routes that those mailmen had been forced to memorize. Still, this outward chaos, it masked inner normality. On the roof, children would play soccer amid the television aerials, oblivious to the airplanes booming overhead. Old men, they would sunbathe. It was like a typical Manhattan block, with the exception that Manhattan's population density was 27,000 people per square kilometer, while scaling the walled city up to that size would have resulted in a population density of 1.2 million people per square kilometer. Certainly not a good place for claustrophobics. Still, by 1980, Kowloon Walled City was starting to become a part of Hong Kong's life. The colonial police had even started patrolling inside on the understanding that they were purely there to keep people safe and not enforce any annoying British laws. So it's ironic that it was right at this point, just as the Walled City was starting to go legit, that the colonial authorities were again making plans to destroy it. This time, though, they would succeed. In early 1986, Sir Edward Yoder was a man with a problem. The colonial governor of Hong Kong, he was all too aware that Britain's time in the territory was coming to a close. 15 months earlier, in December of 1984, Beijing and London had signed the Joint Declaration, paving the way for Hong Kong to return to China in 1997. There was just one problem. Edward Yoder had no idea what to do about the walled city. Like most of the Hong Kong elite, Yoder considered the ungovernable block in Kowloon to be an embarrassing slum, the sort of place that gave refined gentlemen nightmares.
Oh, yes, he probably was like, chip, chip, cheerio. I don't like this Kowloon city. That's a horrible British accent to our British audience. I love you. That's if we could get a British person to properly maybe type what some sort of aristocrat would say, I would appreciate it. But that's just evil British person would be like, chip, chip, cheerio. I don't like this Kowloon city. It upsets my tea and my breakfast. That's a terrible British accent.
Also considered it a perfect propaganda gift to China. Yoder's thinking went like this. If Hong Kong was handed over to China with the walled city intact, Beijing would immediately use it to kick the British. And the last thing a loyal man like Yoder wanted to do was embarrass the crown. From this worry grew the long process that would lead to the walled city's destruction. The first any of the inhabitants heard of this was at 6 a.m. on January the 14th, 1987. That humid day, 360 housing department staff, supported by scores of police, sealed off all of the walled city's 83 exits and fanned through its alleyways collecting information. By sunset, they had registered 19,606 people living within its walls. Eventually, that figure would be revised up to 28,200 people scattered across 8,800 buildings. The residents pretty quickly realized what was up, that rather than fight, they treated it all with a bit of a shrug. "We'll see what Beijing has to say," was the most frequently reported phrase that day. But when Beijing finally spoke up, those residents were in for a nasty shock. In early 1987, the Chinese government declared that they were happy to let the British do whatever they wanted with the place. If they wanted to knock it down, well, good luck to them. See, while Kowloon Walled City was safely within British territory, the Chinese were happy to kick up a fuss over it as a way of reminding London that Beijing might be down, but it wasn't out. Now that they'd got Hong Kong back, Beijing no longer needed that reminder. In fact, they'd much rather see the walled city in ruins than have to deal with it themselves. And, well, with that, the city's fate was sealed. All through the rest of the decade and into the 1990s, the colonial government worked to clear the area. New homes were offered to residents, generous compensation packages were handed out to businesses. Some enterprising landlords even built new homes during the clearance process, specifically so that they could claim extra money. By January 1991, 96% of residents and 51% of businesses had agreed to leave. The colonial authorities breathed a sigh of relief. But this is Kowloon Walled City we're talking about, a place that always refused to play by the rules. If the British wanted to tear this slum down, they were going to have to fight for it. Throughout 1991, there were warning signs that not everyone was happy with the demise of the walled city. Union Jacks were burned in the street while protesters waved Chinese flags. But still, things remained mostly calm that summer, if a little tense. Come late fall, though, they finally exploded. On November the 28th, protests broke out outside Hong Kong's government house. Angry former residents marched through the streets before finally erecting a new tent near Kowloon City. The following year, 1992, there were skirmishes at the walled city. Rocks were hurled at the police and people punched officers. Given the volatility of the situation, the authorities chose to let these incidents slide. That March, a small homemade bomb destroyed a flat vacated in the clearance. Barely a month later, an angry resident attacked police with a meat cleaver, injuring several. In the aftermath, the colonial authorities decided that it was time to finally finish the job. That June, armed riot police converged on the walled city, making for the apartments where the last diehards still held out. There were standoffs, unwise words, the threat of violence. Yet, for whatever reason, things never span out of control. One by one, the last residents left their homes, hands in the air, and surrendered to the police. On July 1st, 1992, police reached the last holdout apartment. At 16:30 that day, the middle-aged couple barricaded inside. They agreed to leave. The moment they stepped out into the bright Hong Kong sunshine, the walled city had lost its final inhabitants. But clearance wasn't quite over yet. Remember that tent that the city protesters set up? Well, by mid-1992, it had become a magnet for former walled city residents, and it was starting to grow. Fearing that another walled city would just spring up, the authorities quickly moved against the encampment. On July 2nd, it was dismantled. Demolition of the walled city began 8 months later, in March 1993. It was a slow process, one that used tools rather than dynamite. For a long time, it was still possible to make out the outlines of the former city, even as its walls finally fell to the wrecking ball. By April 1994, the last of the walled city had been destroyed. After dominating this corner of Kowloon for half a century, the most famous slum in history, it was no more. When they tore the city down, the Hong Kong authorities were acting with the best of intentions. At the time, it was seen as nothing but a vertical slum, the vertical equivalent of Rio's favelas. Yet, just as the favelas can be misunderstood from the outside, so too was Kowloon Walled City. This was a self-organizing community that had sprang out of nothing. This was architecture designed by the people and free from government interference. Over decades, it had grown like an organism, eventually becoming a real-life example of grimy Blade Runner-style futurism. More than that, though, it had become a unique community. It's telling when the South China Morning Post caught up with a former resident who'd received vast compensation for leaving that he told them, "If I could choose, I'd still be running my air conditioner repair business at my walled city shop and leading a happy and stable life." Many others who lived there have spoken in similar nostalgic terms, remembering the food, the people, the feeling of living beyond the normal rules. And it seems this feeling had reached more than just those who once lived there. Today, nostalgia for the walled city is everywhere. You can see it in pop culture, such as the Gotham City neighborhood, The Narrows, which Batman Begins director Chris Nolan claimed was modeled on the walled city. You can see it in games such as Call of Duty Black Ops, which included the walled city as a playable level. You can even see it in Japan, where some wonderful nutjob has meticulously rebuilt 3 stories of the walled city as an amusement park. Apparently,
Only in Japan. Oh boy. Only in Japan could that happen.
they even import trash from the Kowloon area of Hong Kong to keep it looking authentic. Kowloon Walled City, then, is a place that survives in humanity's imagination, living on in sci-fi, graphic novels, and visionary architecture. It may have been a crime-ridden slum. It may have appeared only because of a diplomatic void. But the Walled City was a place that made its mark on history, and who knows if we'll ever see its like again. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did,
Well, don't worry. We see it in the grim, dark future of the 41st millennium in a place called the Hive Cities. We see it in the Batman comic books. We see it in the video game called Stray, and yes, so many other games as well. It was a city made by those that were rejected by society. It's the people that made it. But everything that has a beginning must and will have an end. There's a beginning, middle, and end. So, to my viewing audience, do you know anyone that used to live in Kowloon Walled City? Are you a descendant from somebody who lived in Kowloon Walled City? Did you used to work there? Are you friends with anybody there? Just, those who were once residents there. Or the descendants. Or still survivors from Kowloon City. If they're still out there, hey, probably they are. Type. Regale us with your story. Let us know. What do you remember? Do you have any bittersweet moments? If there's anyone who's a mailman, if you were a mailman in Kowloon Walled City, I want to hear a story. So, something that'll be at least safe for YouTube comment section, though. Gotta be very clear about that. Because I bet all those mailmen and mailwomen have a story to tell. I mean, that's a TV show in its own right. Netflix, give me a deal. HBO Max, give me a deal. Amazon, well, not Amazon Prime. You guys are going to go bankrupt with that Lord of the Rings knockoff. Stupid Lord of the Rings. Oh, orcs can have babies. You want to know who thinks that's full of crap? All the residents of Kowloon Walled City. That's who thinks it's full of crap. Everybody in the whole world. Even if Kowloon Walled City was still around, they'd still think that idea is crap, Amazon. Oh, orcs can have families and babies in Lord of the Rings. Get out of here. Get out of here. This was a great video. First of all, shout out to Geographics. Please support the original content creator. It's the right thing to do. It's the one thing to do. And I expect all you hip, cool cats to please, with cherry on top, support the original content creator. Be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. And to anyone that knew anyone that lives, or if you are somebody who lived in Kowloon City, or a descendant, tell us your story. And bonus points for somebody who was a mailman or mailwoman. I want to hear a story. Let's hear it. But make sure it's safe for YouTube comment section, because YouTube could delete it, okay? So there you go. So be safe out there. Drink that water. Much love. This is Kit. This is Americans Learn. Peace. Much love. And I still dream the dream of Kowloon Walled City and getting those oodles and noodles. The oodles and oodles and oodles and oodles and noodles.